So we're in the second week of what we've been calling a Connect series, where we're going to spend 5 weeks reflecting upon the scriptures together, particularly the Sunday Gospel, and particularly around the question, what matters most? So the idea is I'm going to share 5 answers to that question, which really, of course, what matters most can only be one answer to that. So it's just from 5 different perspectives. So we have something just under 40 groups meeting in the parish each week to do this, to gather in, whether it's online or in person. So I'm not exactly quite sure about how many people that represents, probably about 200, I think, which is really exciting and wonderful. So as I said, the question that we're wanting to kind of address is the question of what matters most. And you remember last week, the answer that we were reflecting on there was to be all in. In the light of the gospel today, the answer to that question, what matters most, that I want to suggest is to be happy. What matters most is to be happy. And even in the midst of COVID and all of the challenges that that's brought, the truth is that God does want us to be happy. Sometimes there's a strand in Catholic spirituality that I think says you're not meant to be happy in this life. That happiness is something kind of elusive in this world. And at its extreme, it's something like the more miserable you are in this life, the richer your reward, the happier you'll be in heaven. It's really unhealthy spirituality, and it's not really authentic to our tradition. The truth is that God does want us to be happy. He put a natural desire for happiness inside of us. It doesn't matter whether you're a person of faith or not. If you say to people, do you want to be happy or not? Unless you've got a really weird sense of spirituality, you say, of course I do. Of course I want to be happy. And so the question that raises, of course, or the issue that raises is we need some clarity about what happiness looks like, because it's clear that our definition of that's going to be really important. What does it mean to be happy in the light of that? But it's very clear that our understanding in the scriptures, in the tradition, you can see it in the catechism of the church, that God desires for us to be happy in this life, not without suffering, not without trial, not without challenge, but in this life and then in the fullness of happiness in the world to come. So to try and unpack that a little bit further, I want to draw upon the work of a Jesuit priest called Father Robert Spitzer. And so I'll just get, Emma, if you can pop the slide up, that'd be great. It's a little bit small. I'm hoping you can see that as we talk about it today. Robert Spitzer says, look, there are four levels of happiness that we need to think about in relation to the desire for happiness that's in each of us. The first one of those that I'm going to talk about is actually level 4 at the bottom of the triangle. This is happiness found at the material level. So we're happy when we've got sufficient food and drink, shelter, when we receive and give affection, in procreation, and in material possessions, things like a house and clothes, a car, and so on. That's the 4th level of happiness. The challenge with that level is that if we focus too much on that, to the detriment of other levels of happiness, there will come an emptiness. The world is full of the stories of very wealthy people who've been profoundly empty inside. They had materially everything they needed and more, and yet there was a gnawing emptiness inside of them. The 3rd level of happiness, according to Father Spitzer, is what he calls comparative happiness. And the idea here is that it's happiness found in gaining an advantage over others through my achievements, whether that's my status, popularity, intelligence, power, or control. It's the sense of comes that knowing that I've done well and in fact that I've done better than others. That's not necessarily a bad thing in itself, as I'll come back to in a moment. But the challenge, of course, the problem with it is that we can't win at everything. If we perhaps win at one area of our lives, if we have a sense that we've actually done the best in relation to others, we can't do that in all areas of our lives. And secondly, to make everything into a competition will only lead to a kind of emptiness and unhappiness as well. So it's not that this is bad, nor that level 4 is bad either. It's just that they're deeply insufficient, okay? And if we focus upon them too much, there's an emptiness that results. The second level of happiness, Father Spitzer calls contributive. This is where happiness is found in the positive difference that you're making to the world through your actions for the benefit of others and also through your empathy. This level is really, it's altruistic, it's focused upon others, but there's the happiness that results from that. You know, if you gave food to the Jesuit Refugee Service food bank drive that we've had the last few weeks, if you've ever helped out on a food van, if you've given to somebody in your immediate family or friends who is in need, you're doing it for the sake of others, but there is a sense of happiness that results in that. We know we feel good for having helped in that way. And that's okay. It's a good thing. There's an important and appropriate level of happiness there. The final level of happiness is found, it's called their transcendent happiness, which is an openness to God, who is transcendent, pure, the fullness of beauty and truth and goodness and love. This kind of happiness is found when we have a relationship with God. Now, one of the things to note about these 4 levels of happiness is that they have different levels of endurance. Some last longer than others, right? I like a steak and a glass of red wine as much as the next person, possibly more than some. But it goes, right? It passes. You've eaten the steak, you've had the glass of wine. That moment of happiness around that doesn't last, it doesn't endure. Not in the same way that if I've become a person who consistently gives for others, a person who has a relationship with God, these endure, these last. There's a happiness here that continues. It's also true to say that there's a depth to happiness at that level 1 and level 2 that isn't always found in those lower levels. There's a certain point where we find ourselves saying, you know, I could get a new car and another new car and another new car and a bigger house and a bigger house and a bigger house, and there'll be some level in which that feels superficial or shallow. So the other thing that you want to note about these is that they can sometimes be in conflict. That in order to actually really embrace those higher levels of happiness, we actually sometimes need to forgo some of the lower ones. There's a sacrifice that's to be made. You can't, I think, be materially super successful and also really be contributive. There's some point there'll be a payoff, a trade-off that has to take place. It's not that any of them are bad. We all need food, we all need shelter, we all need affection. Material happiness is important. We just can't make it dominant in our lives. And that achievement sort of level of happiness, that third level that we call contributive, that's important as well, particularly if we use it for those higher levels of happiness. If I'm good at something, if I have talents that I've developed, if I've done well at school, if I've worked hard professionally, and I use those gifts and skills for the benefit of others, then that comparative happiness is actually being used at that level of contributing to the good of others at a higher level. If we think about it, and tying back into the homily from last week where Jesus gives us the great commandment that we're to love God with our mind, heart and soul, and our neighbour as ourselves as the second commandment, the two great, it's usually called the great commandment, it combines those two things. Really, that's level 1 and level 2 happiness. If we want to be happy, Jesus is saying, these are the things that we're to do. We're to contribute to others, to love our neighbour as ourselves, and we're to love God, which is to connect to that transcendent level of happiness. And so to come back to the Beatitudes, these happy words, sometimes the word there where it says happy are the gentle, happy are the poor, that's often translated as blessed. And it's probably a more accurate translation. But there's something important here about the word happy, that Jesus wants us to be happy, and really in the Beatitudes, what he's saying to us is, here's what it's like to live at level 1 and level 2. Here's what it's like to aim for that. Love God, love others. And in case you were wondering after last week, well, what does that love really look like? Jesus gives us the Beatitudes to show us what love looks like, to show us the nature of love. If you listen and you think about all of the Beatitudes, they're all at the level of either loving God or loving others altruistically, generously, to the forgetfulness of self. So with that in mind, I'm just going to give you a one-sentence definition of each of the Beatitudes. So happy are the poor in spirit. These are the humble who know that they're loved equally, but also nevertheless unconditionally by God. They don't think they're more special than anybody else, but they know they're loved. They're humble people. Blessed are those who mourn, or happy are those who mourn. These are those people who grieve over evil actions, whether they're their own evil actions or the actions of others. Because to grieve in that way over those things is to actually reject and resist them and their power in our lives. Happy are the gentle. The gentle are those who seek the good of others and who tread carefully concerning when they encounter others' weaknesses and vulnerability, they're deeply respectful and careful in those moments and conversations. Happy are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. The righteous are those who are in right relationship with God and all others. We call this salvation, but they hunger and thirst after righteousness because they know that righteousness is not theirs to achieve. To make ourselves right with God, to make ourselves right with others is not something within our power. We need God to help us, to save us. It's God who makes us righteous, but we can hunger and thirst after it. We can seek that and desire it. Happy are the merciful. That's because those who are merciful, those, in other words, who practice forgiveness, know that love is impossible without that. True love is impossible without forgiveness. Happy are the pure in heart. These are those who love God with all their heart, without mixed motivations or competing allegiances. Happy are the peacemakers. These are those who seek to bring God's harmony to others rather than conflict or division. And then happy are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness. These are those whose commitment to right relationship between themselves and God and are establishing right relationship between peoples brings them into conflict with others, that they're threatened or challenged because of their commitment to that. These are the 8 happy words of Jesus. They speak to us of what it means to be truly happy. That's a life lived in love of God and in love of others. I want to finish by suggesting too that it is possible to try and live just at level number 2, to say, you know what, I'm not so interested in the transcendent, in that top level, that first level. But I'm going to be a generous person. I'm going to give to others. I'm going to be generous in what I do for the sake of others. I want to suggest that there's a risk there in focusing just on that, as beautiful and as good as it is. And the risk is this, is that there's a chance that if we find that over time that people are ungrateful or don't receive that help, or we keep working and working away at it, there's a chance that we get burnt out, resentful or bitter about it. We need our giving of others to be shaped and coloured by our relationship, our love for God as well. But it's equally possible to actually be overly focused on number 1, which is about God, that relationship with God, and forget about number 2. When we're in that situation, we're very pious, devout, prayerful people, but we don't care enough about the people around us, the people that God has placed in our lives. The secret to happiness, Jesus says, is to love God with our mind, heart and strength, and to love our neighbour as ourselves. Happiness is found in a relationship with God and contributing to the good of others. As we listen to the happy words of Jesus then, may we put the Beatitudes into practice in our lives.